Alright guys, Merce here, and today I want to talk about this, an IWI Jericho 941 chambered in 9mm. This is our latest addition in the Friendly Fire series. This is a series where I go over guns out of my friend's collection and ask the question, or answer the question, I guess more accurately to say, as to whether or not I would buy them and what considerations I would take when buying them. An opportunity to kind of step away from my own collection, which we've already answered the question whether or not I would buy at that point, and assess something that I haven't spent money on yet and decide whether or not I would. Now with that, why don't we go ahead and get into our standard review format, starting with history. The nation of Israel is known for quite a few things. However, among them that are going to be applicable to this video is one, a lot of practicality in their weapons acquisition, and nationalism. Now, Israel has always had to pretty much use whatever it is that they can get their hands on. They're not really ever in a position to be able to say no to new weapon systems. Even if they're not necessarily standardized, they still want to get whatever it is they can get their hands on, be it, government, U.S. government surplus M16s or captured AKs. They're going to run whatever it is they can get their hands on. But they do still want homegrown designs as kind of a nationalist standpoint and all that kind of stuff. So, with that being the case, in the late 80s, Israel decided that they wanted a homegrown handgun design. Now, at the time, Israeli military industries would partner with Tanfoglio out of Italy to design such a handgun. Now, Tanfoglio is known for making CZ variants that are polished up and ready to go for competition type applications. So it kind of gives you an idea as to what it was that the Israelis were looking for. Now, in order to be able to maintain this whole nationalist point of view and all this kind of stuff, because obviously if you're talking to an outside manufacturer, is it really a homegrown design? But what they wound up doing was having their inputs into what they wanted the handgun to look like. Tanfoglio made the parts, and then they were finished and assembled in Israel. So kind of still a homegrown design. And what they came up with was the Jericho 941 in 1990. Now, this handgun would see export to law enforcement and military organizations all over the world, and would be imported in the United States by Mossberg & Sons. There would be two variants that were imported, the 941F and the 941R. The 941F would have a frame-mounted safety, and the 941R would have a slide-mounted safety decocker. Now, where does the 941 designation come from? Is this just some random selection of numbers? And it is not. It is actually a caliber designation. These handguns would come out of the box chambered in 9mm, but they could be converted to 41 Action Express. Now, keep in mind, it's 1990, so the 40 Smith & Wesson has not come out yet. There is an interest in having somewhat 10mm-like ballistics out of a shorter, more standard frame handgun. The 41 Action Express maintains a 9mm case head, which allows it to be incorporated into a 9mm handgun with the same breech face and magazines, only requiring a barrel and guide rod swap. So initially, Jericho 941 handguns would come with the barrel and guide rod already with the gun. However, the 41 Action Express did not exactly take off, and the 40 Smith & Wesson pretty much put it to bed. So eventually it would move over to where you could order the barrel and the guide rod, and now I'm pretty sure all production of the 41 Action Express has ceased, in addition to barrels and guide rods for these handguns. Now, these would see several importation bursts under several different names. You would have the Baby Eagle, and then also the Uzi Eagle, and a couple other derivatives of something with Eagle. Now, this may or may not be accurate. Keep in mind, I was born in '89, so a lot of the early importation, all that kind of stuff, was when I was quite small and wasn't really paying attention to what was going on with firearms at the time. But pretty much every Baby Eagle I've ever seen has a slide-mounted safety decocker. So that may or may not be the case, and feel free to let me know in the comments what it is that you have. Now, this gun has popped up quite a few times over the years. The most recent iteration and designation is the Jericho 941, even though it doesn't come with the 41 Action Express stuff. And is coming in with slide mounted safeties. This is actually what this gun is. They started coming back in about like 2015, something like that, under the IWI brand name as well. All right, guys, I think that pretty much covers history, other than to point out that these are made under license in Ukraine and Vietnam, which IWI actually has a lot of business with both of those countries. It's quite interesting. Quite a few of their models are made under license in both of those countries. All right, so why don't we go ahead and get into features. So first off, we have a 4.4-inch barrel in this handgun, which is polygonally rifled. And that's interesting because you don't necessarily, that's generally something that you associate with Glocks, but other handguns have utilized polyagonal rifling. What is the advantage of polyagonal rifling? Well, there's less bullet deformation, which is supposed to attribute to better accuracy. And you also get a battered gas seal, which is supposed to give you more velocity. However, a couple of counterpoints to this overall discussion. First off, I'm not terribly interested in a discussion on handgun accuracy. Handguns are short-range options. Generally, if you're talking about self-defense situations, you're talking about 5 to 7 yards with a handgun. I consider practical engagement distances to go out maybe as far as 25 yards with a handgun. If it's beyond that, I'm looking to either avoid the confrontation, escape the confrontation, or find a rifle. And really, even at close-range type stuff, I want to work my way to a rifle because it's still more potent. And that also comes back to the velocity thing. The velocity gains are not going to suddenly turn this handgun from a marginal defensive tool into this exceedingly great defensive tool. The opinion on this channel is still that handguns are convenient fight stoppers, not the best fight stoppers. So I really have no interest in increasing the capabilities of a handgun round outside of FBI specifications for penetration and expansion. So with that being the case, velocity advantages and accuracy advantages, not necessarily that big of a deal. However, you do have to be concerned about utilizing cast bullets with polygonal rifling because those have a tendency to leave a residue behind in the barrel, and if you don't clean frequently or well enough and you shoot a lot of that stuff, you might or could wind up with a high pressure incident in the bore, gun explodes, not a good result for anybody. So it's something to keep in mind with polygonal rifling. I don't think it's that great of a detriment, but I also don't think it's that great of an advantage, if I were to put it very simply and succinctly. Now, our sights are these steel 3-dot sights. They're kind of low profile combat style sights. These are not my favorite sights that I've ever seen on a handgun. They aren't the worst, they're just also not the best. They are not night sights. And, my rear sight doesn't necessarily have a ledge that I could hook onto, a table or my boot heel or something like that if I had to do one-handed manipulations. They're kind of blah, honestly. They're good enough, you can pick them up and all that kind of stuff, but they're not a selling point of this handgun, that's for sure. Now, let's go ahead and talk about this slide a little bit. So you see here that we have these serrations on top of the slide. This is over to cut down on glare. I've never really noticed glare to be an issue with handguns, but I guess they could be if you were to spend enough time worrying about it. The slide is very low profile, and this has a tendency for people to attribute, we're going to talk about that more here in just a little bit. This has a tendency for people to attribute a low bore axis to CZ style handguns. However, to put that into context real quick, if we line up these back straps of a Glock 45 and this Jericho 941, we'll notice that the Glock actually has a little bit lower bore axis. Now, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Glocks just have very low bore axis to begin with. And that's not necessarily to say that the CZ doesn't have a low bore axis. It has a much lower bore axis than what you will find on a SIG P226 or something like that. However, it's not the bore axis that is actually bringing about a lot of the advantages of this particular handgun. So in this case, you still get low bore axis-like attributes out of the fact that you have a very small amount of reciprocating mass going above your hand whenever this gun recoils. And that means that there is less of a action on the pivot or the flippiness of this handgun against the web of your hand. This is a pivot point. Based off of that reciprocating mass going over top of your hand, this is going to cause the gun to be a little flippy if you have a lot of it. Since you have such a low amount of weight going over top of your hand, this actually allows the gun to track quite flat, which is very advantageous. This is the attribute that you're looking for with low bore axis. So this is definitely an advantage. I wouldn't hold that against it. In addition to that, we also have full-length guide rails on this handgun. So we have lots of contact surface between the slide and the frame, which allows the gun to, first off, have very consistent lockup, very consistent return to target, and maintain that nice flat reciprocating mass, that flat recoil profile to it, which allows us to stay on target. This is a great advantage of CZ style steel framed guns. You don't have as much of that in the polymer frame guns. They have longer rails than what you'll find on a lot of other polymer framed handguns, but they don't have the full length rails like you find on steel guns. All right, now these handguns are also chambered in 40 and 45. Now, when we take a look at our serrations, you'll see that we have these very widely spaced serrations, but not a lot of serrated surface, which is kind of a miss, especially if you're someone like me who overhand racks a slide, but we have a very small amount of slide to be able to grip. So I need as much surface area as I can to grip in order to be able to grip and rip the slide. Now, keep in mind, guys, I don't grip and rip slides because of like an outdated concept of, gross motor movement and all that kind of stuff. I overhand rack slides because it works on everything.
I appreciate that.
No matter what handgun it is that I'm working with, if it has a slide, I can overhand rack it and get it back into the fight whenever I'm doing a slide lock reload. So that's why I've stuck with that. I train with a lot of different handguns, so I look for opportunities to be able to pick a method that is going to work for all of them. Now, you'll also note that our serrations are kind of interrupted by a safety decocker mounted on the slide, kind of like a Beretta Mono 92 FS. Now, this does give you kind of additional gripping wings to be able to run the slide, but I have a little bit of an issue with safety decockers, and that is whenever it is that you're gripping them, you could potentially activate the safety type aspect of it, and when you come up with your gun, you wind up with a dead trigger, and that's not advantageous if you're in a situation where you need the gun to work. If you're in a self-defense situation or something like that, any amount of time spent not shooting is potentially detrimental to you. So, and I used to run into this whenever I carried an M9, and what I always wanted to do was put a decocker only upgrade on it in order to mitigate this issue. Now, there is a decocker only version of this handgun, and I did spend a little bit of time looking around trying to find replacement decocker only accessories for this, but they weren't necessarily jumping out at me. I'm sure they're out there, it just might be a little bit more difficult to find. And that is a topic that we'll cover more here after a little bit. Now, something else to keep in mind, guys, is anytime that we're talking about safety or handguns with manual safeties, I utilize them. That is my preference. And that is purely because I don't want to run into a situation where I draw my handgun in order to defend myself, and because I haven't practiced flipping off the safety and somehow that safety got activated, I wind up with a dead trigger. And sometimes, you're walking around and carrying something all day, maybe the safety gets bumped. So that's, even if you just incorporate your draw stroke to check to see whether or not the safety is on, which can be a step, or that used to be part of the M9's immediate action. In addition to tap, rack, bang, it was making sure that the safety had not accidentally been switched on. So that being the case, if I'm carrying a handgun with the safety, I just go ahead and turn the safety on and then incorporate it into my draw stroke to make sure that I flip it off. Continuing on this safety discussion. So I spent a lot of time looking at this, trying to figure out whether or not the firing pin is in line when the hammer is down. And I spent some time looking around on the internet to actually get an understanding of the internal functions of this safety. Because if you look at a SIG P226 or a Beretta Model 92 FS, those firing pins are not in line up until the final motion of the trigger. And that's very important if you're carrying hammer down on a live round. I have not been able to comprehensively prove one way or the other on this handgun. However, I have noticed some things. Whenever I actuate the decocker, the little nubbin of the firing pin that is exposed out of the back of the slide recedes into the handgun. So that way when the hammer drops, it doesn't drop against the firing pin. Now, whenever I look at the motion of the trigger, I see no change to that same little nubbin. So as far as I can tell, this handgun is in line, or this firing pin is in line with a primer right now. If I had a round in the chamber, it would be in line with a primer right now. So potentially any strong strike or drop of this handgun, anything that smacks against this hammer could potentially cause it to go off, as far as I can tell. I've also played around with it a little bit, holding the hammer in place and actuating the safety, and I can see that that little nubbin does disappear into the slide, or recess a little bit into the slide. So with that being the case, if you're carrying this handgun and you don't want to carry it with the safety on, but you do want to carry it with the round in the chamber, I would recommend putting this gun to the half-cock position. That way you don't run the risk of an inline firing train that could potentially cause the gun to go off. You could still get your first double action trigger pull out of it and all that kind of stuff. You just don't have it resting against the firing pin. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about the frame of this handgun real quick. This is an all steel frame, and unloaded, this gun weighs in over 2 pounds. It is quite heavy. However, they do make polymer frame versions of this handgun. Now also, this is the full-size version of this handgun. They also make a compact and a subcompact, and they make the compact and the subcompact of the polymer frames as well. So just something to kind of keep in mind there. Now, you'll also note that we have Picatinny slots milled into the dust cover on this particular handgun. This will work with whatever lights or lasers are Picatinny capable. We'll talk about that more here after a little bit. The front of our trigger guard is textured and flat, so if you're somebody who grips the front of the trigger guard, you can continue to do that. Looking at our controls, we have a large slide release located right here. Now, it's not ambidextrous, first off, but in addition to that, guys, the discussion of slide stop versus slide release is not really one that I engage in. In my opinion, the gun should be able to, or that function should be able to perform as both, so that the shooter can then pick what their preference is from there. However, a couple things on this one. One, it's a little sharp and it does have a tendency to kind of abrade my grip. Two, it's very far out there. As you can see, it's very difficult for my thumb to actually be able to reliably engage that slide release without rotating my grip a little bit in order to actuate it. Now, once again, I run the overhand rack on the slide, so that's not necessarily something that I'm worried about, but it might be something that's important to you. So how I break things down whenever I'm evaluating combat style handguns is that there are two things for me that I want accessible with my firing hand, and that is the magazine release and the safety, of which this gun is accessible. However, if you utilize a slide release in order to conduct your slide lock reload, then I would say that you have a third thing that you need accessible, and that would be the slide release, all accessible with your dominant hand. Now, some people train to conduct a slide release with their support hand. As they go in to build the grip. And that sounds really good in theory, and I have played with it a little bit. However, I've never been able to really comfortably and reliably achieve it. Now, if I spent like a lot of time working on it, I am very confident that I would be able to conduct that reload. However, at this point, it's still not necessarily the manual of arms that I'm trying to pursue right now, so I stick with overhand racking. But that is not to say that I don't acknowledge the fact that slide release, or utilizing the slide release, is a faster form of reload. So there's that. Just go ahead and put that, clarify that position a little bit further. Now we'll notice that we have a nice beaver tail and a little bit of undercut underneath the trigger guard, allowing us to get a nice high grip on the handgun to better be able to work with that low mass recoil that keeps the gun nice and flat and all that kind of stuff. It's a good feature. It's definitely a good feature. All right, our trigger is of course a double action, single action. And I've got to say, that I am less than impressed by the double action trigger on this particular handgun. It's kind of standard. It's not super smooth. It's a little stagey and all that kind of stuff. And I'm no trigger snob by any means, but especially having just come off of a CZ75 SP01 Phantom, which if you're interested in that video, the link will be in the description. This is definitely a little underwhelming. The single action trigger, again, is pretty basic. It doesn't have, the reset's a little far out, but it is tactile and audible, so I do appreciate that. And the brake is good. It's good. It's a good single action trigger. It's an okay double action trigger overall. All right, our slide release, or excuse me, our magazine release is located at the heel of the trigger guard in kind of the American location. Our grip texturing, let's talk about this for a minute. These grip panels are terrible. This gun has no added grip. Just sitting here handling this gun back and forth and stuff like that, the oils from my skin have already made this grip kind of slick. And then we only have some serrations on the front, no checkering or anything like that. Serrations on the back as well. No checkering in order to really help us kind of grind into and keep this gun in place. I am not a fan of the texture of this grip. I consider this a pretty big miss. Now, in addition to that, something that I found kind of interesting, there we go, is that this handgun has a very Glock style or shape of grip. You kind of have the same angle and that kind of hump here on the back and all that kind of stuff. So it actually presents very similarly to a Glock. And I noticed that I have to kind of adjust my fingers a little bit for how it is that I present Glocks, which is fine because it also neatly moves into my preference towards keeping these fingers kind of loose and getting the majority of my grip from my upper fingers. But it's definitely a bit of adjustment. This doesn't have a lot of the typical CZ style shape that we're kind of used to on CZ inspired metal framed handguns. This actually has a shape that's more reminiscent of CZ's polymer framed handguns, which is a bit of a surprise. Normally the steel frame guns from CZ have a lot more palm swells and stuff like that incorporated into them to make them a very comfortable handgun to grip. Now that's not to say that this gun's uncomfortable, it's just to say that it's not as comfortable as a steel framed CZ75. Speaking of the CZ75, this does run off of CZ75 16-round magazines. You can also incorporate any other magazine that is compatible with the CZ75. So like the 18-round magazines out of the SP01 would fit in this grip. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, so shooting this handgun, a couple of things that I noticed. Well, first off, it's 2 pounds, so recoil is incredibly light. But also, it's a 9mm handgun. There's not a whole lot of recoil to tame in the first place, so that's not necessarily as significant of a data point as you might think. Now, another thing that I noticed was a tendency for me to group a little low, and I have a theory on that. I think some of the weight here changes the balance of this handgun under recoil so that when the slide chunks back into battery, it causes the muzzle to dip just a bit. Now, I'm not talking like I was shooting at the head and I was grouping in the stomach or something like that, but it was noticeably lower than other handguns I was shooting at the same time. So I did notice that once I kind of focused a little bit more on my sight alignment and all that kind of stuff, I could still group center exactly like I'm supposed to. It just slowed down the splits a little bit, which kind of puts it at the opposite end of where it's supposed to be with a lot of these features. Now, perhaps more texture on the grip would help with that, but well, we got what we got at the end of the day. However, accuracy was still good. It was still achievable. The gun is a joy to shoot, but I did run into a couple of issues. First off, just shooting this yesterday, I had about 4 failure to ejects, which I was very surprised by. And I've also noticed, ever since I got a hold of this handgun, that I've had this issue here, where the follower is not reliably activating the slide catch, as you can see. And this is actually the worst it's been yet. This is markedly worse than it was even just yesterday. So at this point, I actually have to go ahead and actuate the slide catch on my own. So I don't know if these are just defective magazines. I have noticed it with both magazines that the gun shipped with, but it could also be an instance of perhaps these were left loaded for a long period of time and we have some material fatigue on the springs. There's a wide variety of things that could be causing this, but I would definitely solidly say that it is magazine related, seeing as I am slowly cycling the slide right now and not getting it to latch. So that is an issue potentially that could be problematic for you, the firer, but I would not necessarily sideline this gun based off of that. I think this is an easily rectified issue. All right, guys. So, what are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? Well, that's a little bit difficult. An issue that you frequently run into with CZ75s and CZ75 variants are aftermarket support. IWI does offer some things for this handgun, sights, magazines, holsters, all that kind of stuff, but there's not a wide variety of options out on the market. And that is something for somebody who perhaps is coming off of a Glock or a Smith & Wesson or a SIG, might have a little bit of a struggle with, especially if you're wanting to have just whatever it is that you want. You're actually going to probably wind up having to go with a lot of custom holster makers or something like that in order to be able to match this up with the features, with the holster features that you want. This is especially problematic if you're talking about trying to use this for a duty gun. If you have an employer who has very specific requirements for what your holster has to be able to do, this gun's not going to be for you. In addition to that, this is an exceedingly heavy firearm. This is something that I would identify for use with some sort of dedicated duty type belt or competition type belt. Not necessarily attempt to utilize this in a concealed carry type use where you're working off of your own private belt or something like that, something that's just supposed to hold up pants and now is holding onto an well over 2-pound gun at that point, because we're talking about it being loaded. So I would not recommend this for concealed carry. I would not recommend this for duty use. Competition or just plinking type use, this would be a fantastic option. It is fairly heavy, so especially if you could get some more texture on this handgun, utilizing tape or whatever, you could really hold this thing on target. It would be a pretty good competition option. I also think that when incorporated with the light, this would be a fantastic home defense option. especially since at that point your bedside safe or nightstand or whatever is the one that's going to be supporting the weight instead of your body. So this would be fantastic for that type of use. Now, those are my recommendations. Would I buy it? Based off of those recommendations, you might be surprised to hear that I would. And that is because this would fill the Israeli military handgun, kind of militaria collecting aspect of what it is that I look for in handguns. And if you're looking for more on that discussion, you can check out my video on Milsurp and militaria collecting. However, since this is a handgun utilized by the Israeli security forces, this would fit into my collecting category. But would I use it for hard duty type use, or would it just be a plinker? Well, that's a more difficult question to answer. I would train with this gun. I would get a holster and all that kind of stuff. I would probably upgrade these sights to some Mepro night sights. And I would take it to courses, and I would take it to competitions, and I would use it. However, one of my issues with this gun is that it is impossible to find a holster that works with lights for this handgun. And that's irritating because I have a light rail and I would love to be able to add a light to this gun. Now, does it necessarily need it based off of the uses that I just said? Well, no, not unless I'm going to a low light course of some sort. So maybe this just isn't the handgun that gets used for low light. Or maybe this would be a bedside gun for me with a light on it, and then I would take the light off in order to be able to take the courses and all that kind of stuff. That is a consideration as well. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this interesting. And if you want more interaction with this content, maybe some behind-the-scenes footage or some previews of what's coming up, you should check out the Merce Law Facebook page. The link will be in the description. But other than that, that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.